we want to start the show off today talking about the human consequences of economic sanctions. And that is also the title of a recent research paper by Francisco Rodríguez, our guest, who is a Venezuelan economist, professor of international and public affairs at the University of Denver, and the director and founder of Oil for Venezuela. Mr. Rodríguez, thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Oh, you might be muted. I don't know if that's your end or our end.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. Really an honor to have you here. And your piece that appeared from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Human Consequences of Economic Sanctions, comprehensive survey of pretty much everything that's out there on this issue. But before we jump into some of what you've learned about these human consequences, could you just give us a sense of the scale of how sanctions are really being used around the world?
Yes. Well, part of what I look at in that study has to do with the increase in the use of sanctions, and there's really quite a striking and remarkable increase. According to our calculations, at this moment, 27% of countries in the world are affected by sanctions, and 29% of world GDP is produced in countries that are affected by sanctions. And that's a huge increase in the past few decades. Just 20 years ago, these numbers were less than 10%. 40 years ago, they were less than 5%. So sanctions have become the instrument of choice of Western countries. They're using it essentially whenever there is an issue that they want to deal with in terms of foreign policy that a country is not doing what Western countries would like them to do. They're using sanctions. So now they're affecting a very large part of the global economy and of people in the world.
And in terms of like the actual damage they do on a more like countrywide level, we know that sanctions actually do end up leading to not just, devastating people's ability to like find work and devastating entire countries' economies, but also like to unnecessary death. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's correct. So I looked at 32 studies, all the quantitative studies that have been published on the effect of sanctions using both cross-national data and country-specific data. Of those, 30 find consistent negative effects on living conditions ranging from per capita income, life expectancy, quality of life, malnutrition, stunting. Also, in terms of human rights, they lead to a deterioration of human rights. Some of the estimates indicate very large effects. So, for example, multilateral sanctions lead to a decline in income per capita of 26%. That is the equivalent of the Great Depression. They lead to a decline in life expectancy of 1.2 years for males and 1.4 years for females. That's the equivalent of the global effect on life expectancy of the COVID pandemic. They lead to increases in HIV rates and in HIV rates among children, to increases in child mortality. Everywhere we look, where essentially the estimated effects are similar. If you impose sanctions on a country, economic sanctions in a country, the estimated effects are similar of those of that country becoming engaged in an armed conflict.
Wow. I mean, that's wow. Those are amazing numbers. And I mean, we've seen some of, the countries that you highlight in the report. Of course, well, they're all in the news quite a bit, but Venezuela, and you are Venezuelan, is obviously really at the heart of a lot of the discussion around sanctions, because there's a bit of a back and forth between the U.S. government and the Venezuelan government about what the real impact of sanctions has been on the Venezuelan economy. Having looked at the data, what can you tell us about that?
Yes. Oh, it's very clear that they've had an impact. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the only cause of Venezuela's economic crisis. Generally, economic crises are complex phenomena. They're multi-causal. There are many factors that impact on them. We know that the Venezuelan economy was very poorly managed during several years. We know that the country had a large oil boom, which it didn't use well, so it wasn't prepared when oil prices started declining. It wasn't prepared to handle that decline. So there's definitely a policy component. But we also know that when oil prices started recovering, the economy wasn't able to actually enjoy the higher revenues from those oil prices because oil production started declining. And there's a lot of work identifying the effects. I have a recent paper in the Latin American Economic Review measuring the effects of sanctions on oil production. And sanctions are a key contributor, if not the primary contributor, to a decline in oil production. And what you have to understand about the Venezuelan economy is that oil it accounts for 95% of the country's foreign currency revenue. And oil revenues went down by 93% during the past 10 years. So obviously, if you take an economy and you take its only source of revenue away, then the economy is going to collapse. Venezuela has seen the largest decline ever observed in GDP per capita in a country outside of wartime. It's a 72% contraction in GDP per capita. And it's also seen, as a result of those deteriorating economic conditions, the largest migration exodus ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. In all of those phenomena, there is definitely, decisively, a very significant impact of economic sanctions on the